Hello everyone. Now I'm sure you don't need to hear from me how important, how significant, how seminal The Dark Knight Returns is in Batman lore. I don't think there's anything new that I can bring to the table that many others haven't articulated far better than I could. But suffice it to say, it's probably one of the most critically acclaimed and best loved Batman stories ever committed to paper. And in recent years, no shortage of toy companies have approached producing a line of action figures based on this series. We've had DC Collectibles, we've had Mattel, and now we have McFarlane Toys. And I know I'm a little late to the party this time around because I think this wave of figures came out late last year and I've only just got around to unboxing mine now, but I thought I'd share my thoughts with you over a very short series of videos, taking a look at each of these figures in turn and giving you my thoughts and my review. And so without any further delay, today I'm going to be taking a look at the Dark Knight himself, but also the Build-A-Figure horse, because these two have to go together and I couldn't just dedicate one video to the horse alone. We have to do these two as a pair. So as ever, let's start with the packaging. Now, this is the standard DC Multiverse packaging we're used to from McFarlane's Toys, except the packaging's a little bit broader this time to accommodate the Build-A-Figure pieces. So this is much more of a square-shaped packaging rather than the usual oblong. But as I said, the branding is pretty much identical to what we usually get. We get this massive window display showing off the figure in all of his glory, which is pretty nicely done. Behind him, there is that blue-white collage in tray, which is taking different snippets of different comic books from across the years. I think this is pretty much identical for every single release they have. And then at the bottom we have a little bit of information about who the character is in the packaging. It's just basically black borders. There's not an awful lot going on here. You know my feelings on this by now. It just seems a little bit dull, and I think it's time they had a little bit of a shake-up in terms of this approach. Now, if we look at the side panel, we can see again, yeah, big, thick panel, not an awful lot going on, just the name of the character and the series that it's from. You know my thoughts, I'm sure, if you've seen any of my other videos. This just seems like a colossal waste of a fantastic opportunity to have some wonderful artwork on here that would look great on display if you stack this up on your shelf. And then finally, if we look at the back of the box, we have this fantastic image of Batman on the horse, and this is really advertising the Build-A-Figure because each of the figures in this wave have the exact same image rather than their individual figure images. But we can see those at the very bottom of the packaging, and it's a shame because the artwork for each of these figures is actually really nicely produced, very distinct and unique to each one. The lighting, the photography is really well done, and they look really impressive. So you do get these in a slightly larger format as the trading card inside the box, but in terms of the overall look of the packaging, it's given over to Batman on the horse, and this is really striking as well. It looks really good, and you can definitely put this on display, but it's only really going to work for one figure out of all four in this wave. So let's take a look at the figure outside of the packaging. Now, first impressions is that he's a little lightweight. There is that very plastic sense to this figure that you sometimes get with McFarlane Toys, but in terms of its overall presentation, it looks pretty solid. Certainly, in terms of the sculpting, this is pretty accurate to what we see on the page as drawn by Frank Miller. It's definitely got that Miller-esque Batman feel to it, his shape, his size, his expression on his face. Even the bat symbol is that nice big fat bat symbol there. And it's really nice to note that this is actually sculpted in. This is a separate piece that's sculpted into the body. This isn't just painted in. And it's got a different texture to the rest of the body as well. So this is really good. And this head sculpt is very nicely done. Again, pretty accurate to what I think of as Miller's Batman from this series, and it looks pretty much pitch perfect really. I couldn't really fault this scowling expression. And where there are paint taps, they're very nicely done, particularly on the bottom part of the cowl where we can see his face, his lips and teeth. That's nicely painted. The unfortunate thing is that there is this tendency with McFarlane Toys not to really capitalise on their great sculpts and put a wash over their figures. As I said, they tend to feel a little bit lightweight because of this, both literally in terms of feeling quite light, but also figuratively in the sense that you don't feel like you're getting a depth and texture that you would expect from, say, another toy company. And it's a shame because I think it's all there. They just need that little bit of extra wash just to really bring some of this detail to life. Now, one thing I'm not a huge fan of is the way that McFarlane Toys approaches capes on their caped characters, and this is no exception. They've used a thin rubber material, which is certainly better than some of the other Batman figures I've seen in recent years, but again, there's no wash on this. It just feels a little bit lacking in detail, and it would have been really nice to have just had a cloth cape. We've seen this on some of the other recent Batman figures, and it works so well. I love that approach, and I think it just, it feels more authentic. It just gives it a different texture, and you can usually wrap it around them, and I think that's such a great look for Batman. So it's a real shame that this is just very restrictive. You know, there's not really anything you can do with it. It's not posable, and it looks fine, but it can off-balance the figure a little bit when you're trying to pose him as well. As for articulation, he does have a ball joint in his head, but it's a little bit stiff and it's not as giving as you might expect. So yeah, he can turn his head from side to side and he can sort of wobble it left and right, but not a great deal. He can move it forwards and backwards, but again, it's just a nod really. There's not an awful lot of give in this at all. Now he does have these fantastic ball joints in his shoulders which lift all the way up and out, and this is supported by that fantastic butterfly wing joint at the top of the chest there as well, which allows for maximum movement of this shoulder and arm, which is really good to see, and I love this. Now he does have a strange pin swivel at the elbow, so that lower arm will rotate all the way around a little bit uncomfortably. It will hinge to about 90 degrees as well, which is fine for a figure of this size, I suppose. And then he has these really horrible ball joints in the wrists, which I hate these. They're very difficult to spin around and to hinge forwards and backwards, and it always feels like they're going to snap off. He's got 2 points of articulation in his upper torso. There is this ball joint in the top of the chest area, which is really quite effective. He can move from side to side, and he can just about lean left and right with it. But there's also this articulation in the waist as well, which again will allow him to swivel from side to side, although it feels more like a ball joint, except that it's quite limited in what you can do with it. He can sort of bend forwards and backwards, but again, it's fractional really. Now, there are ball joints in the hips allowing the legs to kick out to the side. There is that complementary thigh swivel at the top there, which is great. And of course, the legs will kick forwards and backwards. There's double joints in the knees, which is really nice to see. So those lower legs can kick all the way back, which is fantastic. And then finally, there's another ball joint at the ankle, which doesn't look great, to be honest, but it will allow the foot to hinge forwards and backwards and allow it to swivel from side to side. And then finally, there is another point of articulation at the toe there. Accessories wise, he's a little light. He does come with an alternate pair of closed fists and then this batarang on a rope. Now this is kind of an unusual accessory, so I do praise them for coming up with something new, and I do think it looks pretty cool, but you can only really put it in this one position. It's not really articulated, it's not really flexible, it just has the one look, and that's absolutely fine. The only real significant issue I have with this is the fact that it's actually quite difficult to get into his grip, and you have to persevere because these gripping hands are really tight, and that definitely presents problems when we look at the horse BAF a little bit later. The closed fists work pretty well as you'd expect, and it's nice to have these. I'm not complaining at all. It's really good to have an alternate pair of hands because it does create a distinctly different look for Batman, which is pretty cool. It's just a shame that we don't really have anything else, not even a loose batarang, which would have been pretty nice. Okay, and as a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to Robin. And as you can see, these look pretty good together, and I also like how they complement each other, or rather contrast each other in terms of their colour scheme as well. Obviously Batman's very dark and brooding, the Robin is very bright and colourful. Okay, so final thoughts from me. I'm going to give this figure 3 stars. Now, I know that sounds pretty underwhelming. It's not a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination. It's absolutely fine, and that's partly the problem. It is just fine, really. There's nothing very special about this release. There's nothing really new here that we haven't seen before. Now, in terms of its good points, I think it's a really good sculpt. I do like that they've actually bothered to sculpt in that bat logo on his chest. That's a nice touch. And most of the paint apps where they do exist are nicely applied. It's just a shame that we don't have more. We don't have a wash running through to give the body some shading. It's a shame that we don't have anything going through his utility belt. Little things like that. Also, his accessories, it's cool that he's got a brand new one. I do like that they've thought outside the box a little bit here with this this rope effect, this grapple that he has. I think it looks pretty cool, and it's nice that we get the additional pair of closed hands, but to be fair, in this day and age, you just kind of expect that. You think that's kind of baseline, really. You expect to get an extra pair of hands with most action figure releases, so it just doesn't feel like they really pushed the boat out. I feel like they could have just thrown in something that was unique, or maybe the first time we've seen something with this character. That would have been really fun. And of course, Batman has no shortage of accessories that he could include, and I'm sure there's something they could have thought of that would have been a nice twist on this. Now, admittedly, he does come with a Build-A-Figure piece, and obviously that plays a big part in it. But otherwise, the figure itself, it's just fine. I just wish there was just something a little bit extra that made it feel special, more robust, more solid. If he had a bit more weight to him, maybe, if he felt heavier, a bit more texturing in the paint taps, then it might have been more impressive. As it is, it's just good. Okay, so moving on to the Build-A-Figure, which is Batman's horse, and that's kind of unexpected, but pretty cool because it is so different to the usual kind of Build-A-Figures that we get, and I'm a huge fan of having horses in this kind of toy line. I really loved it in the Lord of the Rings Toy Biz toy line, and it's really nice to have a horse now that's articulated in the 7-inch scale. Now, as with the Batman, the sculpting is pretty nice. This definitely looks like a horse. It's got lots of muscle definition and things like that, which is really cool, and the saddle has a lot of texture and detail in it as well, which is really, really nicely done. But once again, the letdown is in the paint taps, the paint washes. There's really not an awful lot going on here to give it added texture, added depth. Now, the saddle admittedly does have a little bit more, and it looks much better for it. And there's a little bit around the bridle on the head there as well, but it would have been nice if there was something through the hair, maybe a little bit more detail around the eyes and the nose, just to give this a bit more realism and authenticity. Now, of course, it is articulated, which is great, so there actually is a joint at the top of the head there, so it can move from side to side, and it can kind of move forwards and backwards, although there is this rather unseemly gap between the top of the head and the neck. But there is articulation in the neck that allows the head to move forwards and backwards, and it slides up and down very easily. There's also articulation in the legs, which allow the front legs to move forwards and backwards, not a huge amount, just a little bit, but enough to create different poses. There is more articulation at the middle centre part of the leg that allows the leg to hinge forwards and backwards, and then at the bottom there's a ball joint, which looks a little bit suspect, which allows the hoof to move from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. At the rear of the horse, there is articulation in the tail. It will swish from side to side. Sadly, it doesn't arc up and down. And then there is articulation in the hind legs as well. That hind leg will move forwards and backwards on a swivel. There is a hinge at the knee there that allows that leg to kick forwards. And then there is another ball joint at the ankle that allows the hoof to spin from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. Now, the fun starts when we add Batman to the saddle, but that's also where the problems begin as well, because this Batman doesn't seem like he's really made to sit in the saddle. It's not a very comfortable fit. He doesn't ever really fully sit down on the saddle, which is a problem. He always seems to be riding up ever so slightly. He can get his feet into the stirrups comfortably enough, which is great, but he really struggles to hold the reins, and I can't for the life of me understand how this happens. Why are these reins so thick? They're a very, very thick rubber, and for the life of me, I cannot get these into his grip. I did mention before how his grip seems exceptionally tight, and that's never more true than here. Despite my best efforts, I could not get this to work. So the best I can really achieve is the effect that makes the illusion that it looks like he's holding onto the reins, but trust me, he isn't. And so that's why I have to give it 2 stars. Now, I applaud the effort. I love that we have a horse in the 7-inch scale. This is really cool. This could have other applications. I'm thinking maybe even for my NECA Planet of the Apes figures, this could be pretty cool if I could get them to sit on it. But this is really, really a nice thing, and I think it's a really good idea, and as I said, very unexpected. And for the most part, the sculpting's really nice. The articulation is pretty much everything I would expect. It doesn't break any new ground, but it's very functional. It does all the things I would want it to do, which is really, really cool. But on the downside, yeah, there's a real lack of detailing in the paint apps. Once again, this feels very plasticky. It feels very light in terms of its weight, which is always dissatisfying. It lends it a cheap feel, a delicate feel, which isn't comfortable for most toy collectors. But really, the key issue that I have with it is just, yeah, it doesn't seem fit for purpose. It doesn't seem like this Batman's really made to sit in this saddle, and he really should have been. I appreciate that obviously you want to have a single release figure that can do all the things that you want it to do, but maybe if you're going to take this approach, they should have sculpted it in such a way to allow him to sit very easily in this saddle, and it just doesn't work here. And I cannot, as I said, for the life of me, really get my head around why they didn't make the reins that much thinner and the grip on his hands that much wider to be able to hold this and make it look really cool the way it should have done. So it just just feels a bit short-sighted and a bit of an unnecessary goof, really, on McFarlane Toys' part. But otherwise, you know, pretty cool. The intention is really good, and I think together, if you persevere with it, you can create some really cool looks, and I think it's a really nice thing all in all. It's just a shame it wasn't as well executed as it was intended. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.